So I guess this is the part of the, or at least one part of the program where we start to dive a little maybe deeper at the micro level of particular issues around AI governance. The discussion's been fantastic so far. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data enclosure. And last year we had a paper in telecom policy that articulated a concept of data enclosure, which described the process by which information about user activity generated by digital operations are withdrawn from an open or shared arrangement with other operators and made more exclusive to the service providers whose interactions with their customers generate that data. And we made the case that data enclosure, which was grounded in a theory of property rights and co-production of value, was emerging as a significant feature in platform-based multi-sided markets. There were important governance implications for this, being relevant not only to privacy policy and data protection law and regulation, but also to concerns about platform competition, some of the issues that came up in the last talk. So looking at two cases, we looked at DNS security and also security over HTTP. We looked at DNS over HTTPS and Apple's identifier for advertising. We observed how enclosure kind of reflected this ongoing competitive struggle for the value, utilization, and protection of vast amounts of user data that was co-generated with the platform. That transformation, it involved a combination of technological and also contractual mechanisms, governance, and that was making the data more exclusive to the digital platform providers and turning what was once freely available data, for instance, the identifier for advertising or DNS queries, into a resource that a defined set of actors in a digital ecosystem had more control over. Next slide. So this paper is the first pass at kind of looking at data enclosure that is occurring during widespread commercialization of generative AI. And similar to our previous work and what others have begun to notice here is that data is being enclosed through contractual and technological arrangements, making it more exclusive to data suppliers and AI model providers. And in doing so, the platforms are attempting to address policy concerns, such as copyright, openness, privacy, security. But the platforms also may achieve a competitive advantage by enclosing that data that is different from and somehow more useful than the data that's possessed by its competitors. So to better understand this, we looked at data as an input to some of the leading models training. And then we also took a look at some of the institutions that are emerging around governing data in Gen AI. Next slide. So we began by looking at top performing large models, and this captures pre-training data set size, that is tokens of models, when reported in Epic's AI's database versus chatbot arena performance scores. It's a static analysis of a few models, and it's very limited, of course, but it offers some useful observations. So the top 10 models are developed by the major platforms: OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, and most recently X, highlighting the kind of key role that they play in advancing generative AI and shaping data governance. The firm reporting on data set size obviously varies. There's not much data up there. Meta consistently reports. Google has started to report that, and while OpenAI, Anthropic, and X don't, suggesting that there's a strategic advantage to keeping the information about the data set that you're using for training. Data set and sizes obviously increase over time for those who are reporting, but there is notable variation. So Meta's models are, they use 1.2 times more than Google's models in the most recent models. So the performance patterns differ. So OpenAI, Meta, and Anthropic kind of show linear improvements, while Google is more erratic, at least by these charts. OpenAI's models seem to consistently outperform its models, at least by this metric. And you see the strong positive relationship between data set size and model performance, but we also see smaller data sets outperforming larger ones, and we've heard about that in earlier today too. But as many AI model providers have pointed out in their cards recently, for instance, the Gemini team and Meta's team, it's the amount of data is really only one characteristic of model providers' training data that matters. So a review of available provider model cards reveals qualitative differences in the approaches taken when it comes to sourcing, curating, and actually using the data in training. Providers use many types of data in training, from open web to that's indexed, to deep web that's not indexed, to structured, unstructured, labeled, unlabeled, human created, synthetic, and of course, different modalities. And varying expertise from machine learning, obviously, to NLP, subject matter and legal expertise, and techniques, deduplication, classification, human annotation, reinforcement learning from human factors and feedback to achieve better performing models for particular tasks. Now, none of that really comes as a surprise to data scientists who have long recognized that collection and preparation of data is resource consuming and a critical phase in developing any machine learning model. So less explored is the value of these different kinds of data that's used in training, although we're definitely hearing more about that. So for example, deep learning techniques like the neural networks that underlie Gen AI automatically generate features, which saves on feature engineering costs, right? But in return, it may require larger amounts of labeled data to achieve better performance. Another indicator is just the sheer number of lawsuits by publishers that are out there and content creators against AI model providers and developers for using data to which they hold rights, which generally shows that they value that data. But there are differing views on data and the relative importance of it in training models. So for instance, Meta's Mark Zuckerberg recently commented that individual creators, quote, or publishers tend to overestimate the value of their specific content, right? Going on to say, quote, there are going to be certain partnerships that get made when content is really important and valuable. Next slide. So as data has become increasingly valuable, technical mechanisms like the TDM reservation protocol and the robots exclusion protocol are emerging to help, or re-emerging in REP case, to help rights holders manage how their content is being used in AI training. TDM rep proposed by W3C allows rights holders to signal their preference to opt out their content for text and data mining. It could facilitate model providers adhering to a recognized legal standard, that is the EU's TDM Article 4 exception, and potentially give the rights holders more leverage in negotiations with AI model developers. However, the TDM exceptions are not well recognized, as far as I understand, not well recognized outside of the US and Europe, and protocol adoption has been shown to be relatively small. Despite that, there is work to extend this protocol to AI specific activity. Next, defined in RFC 9039, the robots exclusion protocol is used by over 4 billion websites to signal to specific crawlers what uniform resource indicators or identifiers rather, covering file locations and file names, the crawler may or may not access. And as Longpre et al. Has shown in their paper Consent Crisis, the robots text has been increasingly used to signal that content is off limits to AI providers, crawlers. So in 2024, Google, or a Google affiliated author rather, submitted a new internet draft, rep extend, right, to the IETF to increase the functionality of rep.
Absolutely. Here's a breakdown of the author submitted.
You're listening.
I
This is good advice.
Out of control, out of control.
You said the magic word. You said people.
We finally have a definition of AG on.
So where was I? Yeah, so Longpre et al. Had shown, they show how the owners of websites that are in the Google C4 dataset, which is a subset of the Common Crawl, are increasingly using robots text to signal that they don't want their data crawled. Google affiliated author submitted a new internet draft to extend the functionality, and our RepX implements that via some new response headers and also HTML meta tags, and it suggests two possible rules that could govern data use, forbidding indexing of a website and forbidding full reproduction of the content. But it doesn't really specify additional rules with regard to AI training. So some content providers may want their content scraped, but they want attribution, or it's things like that, variants. So at a recent IAB workshop, various stakeholders noted some of these problems. They expressed concerns about the protocol's limitations, including the need for authenticating bots, or good bots rather, coordinating standardized vocabularies for these rules. So a collective action problem, and the need for infrastructure to support both of those. But probably most importantly, it's not possible for the websites to enforce their preferences with these protocols alone. Neither protocol is a substitute for content security measures or access authorization. So finally, given that bots are a pervasive feature of the digital economy, AI model providers are distinguishing their bots, allowing website owners to kind of selectively block. For example, allowing search bots to crawl their material, but no data collection bots. Or Apple and Google also similarly have developed extended versions of their crawlers, of Applebot and Googlebot, that enable website owners to signal preference concerning content, whether it should be used to train their models or not. And importantly, if you use that, that won't affect your results in search. Next slide. So in terms of contractual mechanisms, again, Longpre observe that companies are increasingly incorporating into their terms of services restrictions on data scraping and AI training of their content. And that represents a way for the websites to assert their property rights and define the boundaries of permissible data use. Now, the value of data to AI model providers is becoming apparent in the licensing agreements that were mentioned earlier. OpenAI has confirmed the largest number, to my knowledge, at least in what's been publicly reported, of around 15 deals, including agreements with multiple news organizations. And reporting reveals that that data is being used for several purposes, from model training to avoiding copyright liability associated with model outputs. And contracts may include terms about the frequency of scanning, the type of content that can be accessed, and also attribution, although I'm hearing that it doesn't always work exactly as imagined. So data suppliers have signed deals. Interestingly, the data suppliers have actually signed multiple deals with multiple AI platforms. So I was definitely interested in the comment in the last session that there were exclusive deals being signed between data suppliers and model providers. So for instance, Shutterstock is a good example. They've signed 6 deals with AI developers, including OpenAI, Meta, Google, Amazon, and Apple. And their new computer vision data line of business provides metadata associated with the photos. It's human developed metadata. It's highly valuable in training. And that is a growing business line for them, doing over 130 million in revenues this last year. So as data in demand for training is vast, new market-based collective mechanisms are emerging, or at least being considered. For instance, there are formations of groups like the Dataset Providers Alliance that aims to establish industry standards, licensing terms, and promote best practices to help ensure ethical and responsible use of their content. Advocacy by the Authors Guild in the Copyright Office's inquiry last year seeks legislation to establish needed legal protections for any market-based collective rights management. Now, the historical role of CROs is well-trodden ground as a governance solution for aligning the incentives and rights of users and creators of intellectual property. That was work done by Rand, actually, back in the 80s, I think. Maybe even, yeah, the 80s. However, in the context, as Besson notes, in the context of generative AI, that approach really faces some practical challenges given a modern globalized digital economy. So first, given a kind of a vast array of data that's being consumed in training, the sheer number of and variety of potential copyrights to be negotiated seems prohibitive and would likely require multiple CROs. More importantly, existing CROs are typically operate within a single jurisdiction. And so creating a patchwork of agreements that would need to be enforced. Next slide. So while the above mechanisms have received much attention, it's important to recognize that there are other market-based data governance that is occurring, where transactions among actors are driven by information and price mechanisms and enforced by law and contract. A simple example are APIs. Present an opportunity to improve governance of data used in generative AI, offering solutions for privacy, security, service level definitions, licensing, and integration. API monetization is growing, it's substantial. It's forecasted in the multiple billions. For example, in April 23, a well-known case is Reddit. They announced a plan to begin charging for access to its API and has since signed agreements with multiple AI providers. Over the past decade, platforms have emerged that bring together data suppliers and firms, integrating machine learning techniques into their operations. Databricks, Snowflake, and startup data firms like Defined AI all source and aggregate and license data from multiple data suppliers and provide value-added services like APIs, analysis, and AI model development for firms through contractual agreements. For example, there are platforms incentivizing individuals to be data collectors and data storage, platforms with cultural, language, and geographical expertise, like Kangaroo LLM, I think is an Australian one. There are firms providing structured, tailored data crawls of the web for academia and firms. So training AI is really just one purpose for what this data from these platforms might be used. Other uses include competitive or threat intelligence, sentiment and trend analysis, account and identity theft, brand monitoring, financial business intelligence, sales and campaign performance, that kind of thing. And the customers span, multiple sectors. And an example, like a nice clean example of how data suppliers and model providers are all co-producing value comes from web data platform Webs.io that collects real-time news data through its API, and then that's integrated with scripts that use OpenAI's model to enable customers to produce reports to help manage supply chain risk. So finally, a substantial amount of cybersecurity is produced by intermediary platforms. For instance, ISPs have a strong incentive to protect their networks and their customers from malicious activity. And by taking on the role of producing cybersecurity, they produce security for their customers and then also the broader ecosystem. And that approach is now being extended to AI, data governance. For instance, security platforms that have long offered bot management techniques, whether it's traffic or behavioral analysis, are now detecting bots used with AI models and allowing their customers to monitor those bots and what they're accessing on their websites, identify and decide which bots and really which organizations can crawl their data, which parts of the site are accessible, and even propose prices for data access. So this extension of monitoring and filtering encloses data that was once freely available. And importantly, it creates a basis for negotiation and the ability to enforce agreements between parties. So the next slide. So I'll wrap up there. I think the emergence of commercialized generative AI really helps illustrate a broader implications of data enclosure in the digital economy. You can see access to high quality data is becoming more important to AI model providers, and therefore, as the value increases with that data, we're going to see more and more attempts to enclose it. You see a variety of governance happening. You see the market-based governance. You see the contractual governance put into effect by firms. You see collective networked forms of governance where actors have to come together to collectively decide on rules. It's really in a bunch of different places. And I think it's important that we start to shed light on more of those forms of governance. So, thanks.
So our paper, I think, caught Milton's attention because of some of the history and the technology. So we're going to try and do both. I'm going to start with just the genesis of the paper. It's one of the great things about working and embedding myself with the ML folks here. We're up on the 11th floor. Mark came by and said, hey, OpenAI and some of these gen companies are trying to claim ownership of the creations. And I just said, well, that's stupid. Facebook made that mistake years ago. It'll get solved pretty fast. And frankly, the internet jumped up and down and it changed relatively quickly. But then I'm trying to think about what Milton's been trying to get us to look at. And I guess as a matter of political economy, you can see the move is a classic overreach by a company to try and take too much ownership. But then OpenAI kept going, right? And it keeps launching its software and doing things. And it gets to this point where Sam Altman says openly, quote, what I think you can't do in the lab is understand how technology and society are going to co-involve. You just have to see what people are doing, how they're using it. In other words, I'm just throwing it out there. And he was, of course, claiming AGI and harmonic convergence and who knows what else. But what happens along the way is it catches a lot of attention. And here come the lawsuits, right? This is where the law professors kind of go, well, what exactly is going on? They poke at it, and a few people in what from the cybersecurity standpoint would be considered more of an attack are able to shake it and get, whole chapters of Harry Potter or other things. And oh my God, perhaps Sarah Silverman's book is buried in there somewhere. Must be copyright infringement. It turns out, if I remember correctly, Mark, in some of their early papers, they're so academic mindset, they openly say they're using, what was it called? Book what?
Is it book corpus?
I think it's called book corpus, which is a known illegal data set of copyrighted books, 300,000 of them. And that combined with a little bit of attack, right? Small parts of the system to what I think Laura was saying earlier really resonated with me was we are, I think, letting somewhat small aspects of the issues, the tails wagging a bigger dog here in terms of really what we think about these systems. But it makes news, it gets people excited. And I think the pent up frustration with Silicon Valley meant we can go after big tech and we can sue them. And it's the old copyright things from way back. I was at an event where in fact, someone from a major news organization said, I'm looking forward. I believe there's a cloud on the title of anything they do because they've been using my websites, right? This explains some of what we've been seeing. But this was a few years ago when we started thinking about this. And so I started asking Mark, I noticed something else. there seem to be what we just talked about, new signals coming, saying, well, we kind of like to be indexed, right? Same problem in news and Google way back. We really want to be found. We're worried that you're allegedly stealing our money. And there was an equilibrium. And I said, but they seem to be saying, we don't want this sort of other stuff. And Mark came up with a great phrase, like, so they're saying, scrape but don't train. It's like, yeah, that's it. Isn't that a problem, Mark? It's like, oh yeah. Because, right, as academics, we want access to that data also. It's not just OpenAI. And it creates a bigger question. So then I had to ask him some of the things that I always get asked by skeptical law professors, right? Oh, do they really need the data? Is it important? Why do they even want the books and all the material on the web? So the things that we came up with was, let's talk about why you want to be able to scrape the data. What are LLMs in reality? And what are the goals? And with that, let Mark take over for a bit.
We wanted anything that we were going to write about, talk about, to be really grounded in the realities of the technology, where these partnerships, I think, are kind of fun and interesting. So I'm now going to do something I've never really done before, just try to talk us a little bit through the technology to ground our understanding without slides. And to be frank, if I put a bunch of diagrams up here, who cares, right? But I think the place where we really started was, what is it that people are trying to do when we created large language models in the first place? And I think, there's multiple perspectives on this, multiple paradigms. Historically, it was about the research. There's this broad academic question. Can we make fluent understanding machines generating machines? We've always, since Turing's days, wanted to talk to our computers, right? And that's a very specific goal. And to do that goal, you want general understanding of what language is and what it does and how we communicate. But then at some point, right, you cross a line to application. And what do we want in a lot of applications are question answering. I want a Google, what's going on here? I want to be able to ask a question, like I Google something and get an answer. And that requires something very different that requires memorization of facts. And these are two very different kind of competing things. And they stem from how large language models work. So a large language model is probably, we've already established, is a word prediction machine. So you come up with a phrase like, what's the example I use? The cat visited the litter and you want to know what comes next. We're all thinking box, right? It could have been other things like mate, litter receptacle, litter kumquat. Some of these are very likely, some of these are very unlikely. So the machines are trying to do is find those high likelihood things. Now, how this happens though in the large language models really matters. They're using something called transformers. And you might be thinking, what's a transform? What does that word mean? What are we transforming words into? And what transformers do is they take simple words and they turn them into more complicated made up words that actually kind of have semantic context. So I'll give you another example. The cat left the litter mates to use the litter like box, right? So I use the word litter in here twice in two completely different contexts. How is an AI supposed to understand litter mate versus litter box? Well, what it does is it successfully merges words together. So it says, litter and mate seem to go together. I'm going to make up a totally new word. It's a gibberish word. It's only numbers, but it means the equivalent of putting these two words together, litter mate. But it also comes up with cat and left. I mean, the verb in which cats leave things, right? That might not make any sense to us, but maybe it's useful. And litter that is used, like it puts litter and use together. And why this is important, because at the end of the sentence, when you want to guess, should it be litter mate or should it be litter box, right? If I understand the context of this sentence, meaning the cat that's doing the leaping thing that only cats do from the litter mate place to the place that only cats use litter, right? There's only really one word that really makes sense there, box, at this point. So it's taking the guesswork out of what these words mean from a perspective. And that is important because as you do that, AI becomes more of a memorization machine. Okay, so getting into this notion of generalization and memorization, right? if you ignore everything I just talked about, the one thing I should remember is large language models do two things. They generalize and they memorize. And this is necessary for how they work. Generalization is when lots of different words work. So I dropped the ball and it blinked, fell. You don't have to memorize that only balls fall when they're dropped, but other things also fall, right? That's generalization. Generalization is very useful for banter, chit chat, poetry, things like that. But it's not good if you want to memorize for facts, right? There is no general principle that expresses birth dates, for example. Everyone has a unique birthday and they're pretty much randomly distributed, right? So the only way that a large language model could really be able to answer a question like, what is Mark's birth date, is to have created this imaginary word, this imaginary concept called Mark Reidl birth date 1970 something something. Right? You didn't think I was going to tell you what the actual okay.
That's the social security number next.
They know these things too. So, and it also turns out that the bigger model you make, the more capacity they have for memorization. Now the problem is you don't get to decide whether it generalizes or whether it memorizes. So sometimes you ask it an innocuous question and it just spits out literal text from a book. Something like that. So again, why this matters is from a research perspective, we want generalization. From a chit chat perspective, we want generalization. But if you're Google, if you're Microsoft, OpenAI even now is getting into, the search, the fact answering sort of question. You have to have this memorization.
Just to put up, right, so think about misinformation, right? The more you want something particular and accurate, you gotta have something that is particular and accurate memorization. Fair enough?
Yep. And then hallucination is the opposite. That's when you get generalization when you need memorization. In some sense. Making up things because it seems reasonable, but it's actually just not true. From our understanding of truth. Right. All right. So where does all this take us? Why did I kind of talk us all through all this? Is what does that tell us about how we can address some of these questions that have come up around lawsuits? And I think we can look at, now we looked at the insides, we can look at the outputs, how this leads to certain outputs, but also we can look at the inputs, like how these things get trained. So like one question that comes up from the output side is if we just think about this regurgitating Sarah Silverman's book, or regurgitating Harry Potter sort of thing. We all now kind of understand a little bit more why it happens. Can this also help us understand how we might combat this? Right, so.
Just so you know, the way this happened is, again, I just said, Mark, what you just explained about what we may want this thing to do I even need the whole book? He said, well, no. Because
No.
What could you do?
What could we do? Well, all right, so if you want to train on language, you need examples of language, right? But if you want to prevent from any one sentence, like, okay, so here's really the issue I think that we were talking about was regurgitating entire chapters. Because I think, no one's really gonna want 3 or 4 sentences of Harry Potter. You want to read the whole book. And at the time we start talking about this, you could get a lot of it out. But you don't have to read every single sentence in every single book to learn how to talk, right? To be this fluent, understanding, generating sort of thing. So a really simple solution is just give it every other chapter of every book. Give it every 5th sentence, right? You get still most of the context, but in terms of like, I can't produce the 7th sentence of Harry Potter anymore because it just wasn't in there. I'll give you the first 6 and then I'll give you 8 through 10. And this is actually kind of what Google Books already does, right? They won't.
We're thinking about search
Visual pages.
and snippets, right?
Yep.
It turns out, what I was pushing him on was like, well, you're right, we can do a lot. We could get very sophisticated emulation of fantasy novels, right? Which are their own subset, or sci-fi. But we could mitigate the chances that you're gonna cough up a full page or certainly not a chapter because it's just not in there.
You won't get exactly what Dumbledore's wand looks like, but
Right.
lots of people talk about wands. You'll
Right.
get the idea of what wands can do. Yeah, so, but then, when you need the facts, like you really want to be able to answer the question, what shape was Dumbledore's wand? What color was it? That is a different question. That is a different need for the data.
Yeah, so that was the friction as we kept talking back and forth. I sort of put on my hat as if I were product counsel or insight, one of these companies, what would I do to stop? And it's like, well, yeah, you could do that. And you'd get something that from a pure going to a CS conference is still very robust. But as soon as you get all that money and you want a product, it turns out people are not as interested in paying a ton of money for, ooh, I wrote a cool fantasy novel for fan fiction that actually doesn't rip off anything, right? They want other products. The money's pouring in and the paper gets into all the ways that that's a problem. But what I started to look at was, well, wait a minute. What else could we do on outputs? Well, given that this is technically possible, I think what a lot of this industry has to do is remember the past, where Milton started us this morning, frankly. Search, as we said, already figured out an equilibrium about how much of a web page or not to show. Wall Street Journal very much is paywall, good luck, click here. Other ones want a little more to tease you, and they link back to the source. That's already quickly, during the writing paper, a lot of companies, especially Google, but I think to an extent OpenAI, if they're giving you an answer, they'll give you a bit and they'll link you to the source. This also deals with what we said this morning. That's superior, right? When you're asking about quality of information in disasters, go to the source. So a better service, if that's what you want, if your goal is to get good information that's still conversational, link to where it came from, because sooner or later, to Victor's point, a human agency has to double check. And you enable that with a link and this is where it came from that's hopefully true, right? You can't win it all, but you could do a lot more than they did to start. They should have started in this place, in my opinion. I think that was extraordinarily irresponsible about how OpenAI played the game to begin. Google Books, as we said, I happen to have been there, so maybe it was stuck in my head when the appellate court said this was good, but it dawned on me, I said, wait a minute, how did they get away with that? That's a huge corpus. Well, guess what? In the district court case, the court said something fleeting, but this is where lawyers get excited. Something effective, in any event, they had legal access to the underlying work because Google was working with the libraries. HathiTrust works with libraries. First sale doctrine in the US, you buy a physical copy, you can do what you want for the most part, right? You can't copy it and then sell that copy, but that's established. It is not a copyright violation if you have legitimate access to the work to train a model. What OpenAI and these companies have done is ignore enough of that. They're giving the copyright industry a second bite of the apple, in my opinion, in a very bad way that we've seen. The enclosure stuff is coming hard again. So, well, we talked about that. Basically, fair use, one of the things that they got wrong was using illegal source material. And frankly, given the amount of money they had, for 300,000 books, the rough moving average price for a book is $20. They could have bought the books. They could have done what Google did. By the way, yes, I worked at Google. Believe me, there's no love lost given the way I left. I'll go with that. Point is, they did it right back then. They invested money in digital scanners, which is actually a new innovation. They made better ones. They had the money to do it. It was a vision. They did everything actually quite on the up and up as far as the ethics of it, except that publishers didn't like it. But legitimate copies, invest in the technology, keep it secure, only publish small bits of the material, which actually turned out, in that use case, increased access to books in several ways, because people turned out, they put in links, and guess what? Books that were never known before got bought. Very elegant, actually, in terms of what you want in a back and forth of this sort of tech market. So one thing to make sure of when we talk about this, though, and what's interesting about and hearing more, I'm grateful for the discussions and Andrew's insights about where this is headed, because we were talking about this and I predicted there'd be more money in shutdown. One thing Mark and I talked about is, well, look, public domain, what people should know, if you don't, right, in the US, we're talking 1929-ish, extraordinarily biased, right? Not overtly racist, just nothing before 29. That's a lot of science at the very least, let alone other voices, right? Lots of things were not published, even in the last 20 years. So groups that now have access because of digitization, because of the stuff that the first panel talked about, right? The ability for more and more people, LGBTQ, minority voices, et cetera, to get online and publish has exploded. But if it's all under copyright, we're gonna have a real question about how is this thing gonna, whichever version of bias you want to argue about, the models need the data. There is a paradox stemming from privacy. We hate privacy violators. We don't want to be in your data set. Your data set doesn't represent us. Hello. You need to pick one here. Now, differential privacy, some cool things to kind of mitigate, but for this, it becomes all the more interesting and questionable. What do you want? What are we building? So you get serious bias the more you cut off access to the and create enclosures as we just heard. That's one of the things we're trying to get at here. So then as I thought about it, I said, well, wait, Google's got this huge amount, 40 million. And then our friend Matt Sag, who's done work with HealthyTrust, I think they've got 20 something million on secure servers. And I said to Mark, I'm just the unfrozen caveman lawyer, but is there a way to have access to that? And he said, indeed.
There is, so first of all, Google's in good shape, right? They gotta go back and get some other data, they're doing that, right? But what about everyone else, right? Is there a way to kind of legitimately give this data in a way that's secure, that doesn't create these leakages where you have a little bit of empty.
And the provenance, right? It's already been blessed by the courts as a legitimate data set.
Right, and so the solution was actually pretty straightforward because there are already existing processes out there by which we train our models on other people's servers. And when you train something on a server, both the data and the code have to live on that server. Right, so you could, we'll take Google and we'll take books as an example here, but Google could make it possible for me to train on their book corpus, their legitimately sourced book corpus. All I have to do is I have to transport a few K worth of code over to their system, have everything train inside of their system, and then I get the model back. Of course, the model has munged all the data, like there's no literal text, it's just numbers at that point, so it's virtually impossible to reconstruct all the original data from the first place. Now, Google might ask for some money to get access to that, but you know, that's like going to your neighbor and asking to read their book. Right, I think one of the more interesting things, and you guys like this of all things, right? This is nothing unusual from a CS perspective. Now what I think is even more kind of interesting is, you know, how they take library systems, could they be running servers, become not just kind of a place where we go to check out books and kind of learn the knowledge, but as a public source of legitimate training data, which would put, I think, kind of excitingly put libraries in a whole new kind of limelight and frame in terms of their value to society.
Yeah, and part of the reason I picked Google was the courts explicitly looked at their security, found it strong. It's in their interest to keep it secure. So when the publishers go, no, those copies will get out, we're like, actually, no. We came up with numbers. I'll be honest, the economists in the room, I made up stuff. I just said, well, what about? I said, how about 10 cents for a whole book? So $30,000 for the number that they used for OpenAI. Really low? Yes. I'm interested in academics having access. You want to scale that out for a private entity and say, you guys have to pay more? Fine by me. But the point is, it's there, it's legit. The market issues then become a secondary issue. One other interesting thing, as much as we were just chatting about the Zuckerberg quote about it, and look, it's mean, it's true. But we also thought the irony of what we realized is, well, what if you just wanted random sentences from the whole corpus? It might be only a few cents a sentence. Guess what? Oh, we expect that to work leveraging copyright history. Create a pool, right? Google gets some money, and the reason I kept it low is Google should not be getting a windfall. Some money to administer, and then a pool that could go back to authors. But the truth is, figuring out how much an author individual work or even sentences, if you're smart about mitigating, it's going to be tiny. But that's the nature of digitized copyright, frankly, right? Spotify, et cetera. We're going to have that problem anyway. But you could create a pool, and actually some countries do this. Milton's like, watch, I'll go faster. So simply put, there's some other things we could do from copyright history. When we ran into digital audio issues, there's actually a fee on old CDs and DATs, if people remember that. You create a pool. You could actually have a levy every book. And roughly, from what I can tell, 50 cents per unit that opened it up to being able to use for training would be almost $500 million a year. If you want to do $1 per, almost $1 billion. That's a pretty good chunk of change to go keep publishers relatively happy. Whether they'll legitimately feed authors, again, that's an old problem in copyright. But the bigger issues are robots.txt. We think that's another big piece of the puzzle. Since we've heard that, we know that do not train signals are coming. I will go a little faster since Milton did look at his watch and say this. Ironically, AI companies and researchers have to learn from the history of technology and copyright law and stop screwing up. Don't be reckless and let these small tails wag the entire area. It's horrible. We need better systems to access good copyrighted data for a host of reasons. We've shared some ideas on how we think that could go. But I think the law really needs to maintain that training models on copyrighted data is fair use. It's the outputs that matter, not the way, unless you used illegitimate copies, that you trained at that point. I think courts should reject the position that all use of copyrighted data needs permission or payment. That's the copyright industry dream. It's a bad dream. It's a nightmare. And I think that they should clarify that actually ignoring robots.txt or do not train signals is not a per se violation of the law. The paper gets into why that should be so, but there's a long history in copyright about if it's open access, you should be able to do a lot, especially on the back end. In other words, keep the internet open, allow broad use of inputs, punish output violators, and basically scrape, train, but deploy responsibly. And that's it.
Everyone, my name is Jyoti. I work with the IGP crew, and I have the privilege of being the last presentation today. So I would request you to please pay attention, even though it may be hard. So today we're going to explore how India is focusing on data in its efforts to govern AI. But even though I'm talking about India, which is where I'm based and the jurisdiction I study the most, I feel the lessons are applicable to many other countries that are operating in a similar context or dealing with similar circumstances. Next slide. So let's start by examining what is India's vision of digital sovereignty. India's vision is rooted in its state-centric approach to managing important domestic industries. It is also motivated by its global aspirations. India wants to be considered a serious market, a serious player in all sorts of governance, whether it's internet, whether it's AI. It's also motivated by a larger geopolitical agenda. India's neighbors with China and the US-China trade war has kind of signaled to it that even Western democracies are prioritizing their industrial policy and therefore gives India a bit more leeway to kind of insert itself into these global governance platforms or arenas. So some of the rationales that the government uses to kind of push the idea of digital sovereignty is economic prosperity and national security. And especially with the National Democratic Alliance, which has been in power for 10 years, economic prosperity and national security have become intertwined in its governmental agenda. And that's resulted in this policy trajectory where they're talking about self-reliance, where the idea is that India needs to reduce its dependence on other countries. While that is the long-term goal, there's also a growing recognition that India is not integrated enough into these global arenas to kind of reduce dependence. So it's trying to do both simultaneously. Getting more into data sovereignty and how sovereignty applies to governance of data in India. There are two prongs to the data sovereignty approach. The first deals with restriction of data, where the government is laying down institutional arrangements and policies that restrict access to and sharing of data, or limiting its import and export. Under this prong, link between data and territory is emphasized to limit access to data to entities that are based in a certain territory, which is India in this case, or to handpick foreign companies, compelling them to move part of their operations to India through forced localization mandates. Data is also presented much more secure if it is located in the territory where it is being generated. The rationales vary for restricting access to data from challenging big tech dominance and colonization of data that the Western countries have unleashed upon India to national restrictions are also justified as responses to privacy, as a measure of cybersecurity, as an attempt to apply national laws to data generating companies located outside the country. Security concerns are also used to extend control over new categories of data, and we see a lot of artificial categories being created to extend control over data and platforms. For example, we have something called a significant data fiduciary or significant intermediaries or critical infrastructure, these terms are not narrowly defined, but they allow the government and give it broad enough interpretation to include a wide range of services and platforms in its regulatory path. The other prong of data sovereignty focuses on accumulation of data. Here, the underlying idea is that individuals and communities generating data are by default the owners of their data. Consequently, they have rights over their data, including how it is and how it should be used. Under this view, principle of consent is used to operationalize ownership. The second justification is that data is treated as a tradable, ownable resource that individual communities, the state must exploit. And generally this thinking and this rationale helps to create a data market, whether it is for personal data or non-personal data. Data is also framed as property to bring in familiar market-based concepts like commodity exchanges into data governance frameworks. Again, the rationales vary, but broadly, compelling individuals or communities to share data is justified and kind of pushes them to participate in data markets. And generally, these efforts are, justified as trying to gain public, economic, social value from data. The state also relies on the doctrine of eminent domain, wherein it has the power to compel enterprises either to open up data resources, to facilitate the growth of data markets, or to compel individual or communities to share data without their consent. So it is kind of strange where you're also relying on the idea of consent to operationalize ownership, but the state is also using the eminent domain framing to do away and not focus on consent. Next slide. We've covered this. Next slide.
Next one.
Next slide. Yeah. So India has stressed that data is a sovereign asset and Indian control of its data is non-negotiable. As AI models grow more powerful, it's becoming clear that data strategy is just as important as model architecture for advancing capabilities. India's approach therefore goes beyond the hyper-technical focus on compute and large-scale models that has dominated on the global stage and is intrinsically linked to the data strategy that I just laid out. So it's trying to restrict data and accumulate data. Next slide. So under the data-centric approach to building AI models, so India has a lot of experience with building databases linked by APIs, prominently through platforms like IndiaStat. Integrated data systems have become the default approach to addressing digital needs in India. Large sovereign data sets are considered essential for ensuring trustworthy AI. And the notion is that AI regulation would be ineffective if without establishing these data sets. And that's the notion that has taken hold. India's AI strategy includes efforts to collaborate with the industry and other stakeholders to restrict access to and simultaneously create new avenues to accumulate data. Next slide. So restricting access to data to advance AI capabilities. The local data storage. So like I mentioned, the restriction strategy, the emphasis is on data and territory and data and national security, and which leads to local data storage and processing requirements. In the context of AI and data sovereignty, this is propelling competition in the data storage market. For example, Google's Gemini 1.5 large LLM, Indian organizations now have the option to both store the data at rest and conduct machine learning processing entirely within India. So Google has basically enforced data localization in India. The move is aimed at enterprises in the public sector and financial services due to the sensitive nature of data that they handle. And Google is also pitching it as a way of reducing the costs of using these models and improving latency in some of these sectors which require real-time transactions, etc. Coming to data and territory, we've had ministers who have indicated that integrating AI into India Stack, which is India's efforts to create digital public infrastructure, digital identity, digital wallets, is part of the broader innovation journey in India. We have technocrats like Nandan Nilekani who are suggesting that the adoption of DPIs essentially lays the groundwork for AI first systems, providing both training data and a new consumer base for AI applications. But again, with the whole DPI and identity and wallets, these are communities that are tied to a territory and to a certain sovereign-led initiative around identity and wallets, and AI is being infused into these processes. Next slide. India is also enabling data accumulation and sharing. So data is treated as a tradable asset. The draft India data accessibility and use policy called for monetization of Indian citizens' data. We also had Chris Gopalakrishnan, who was the chairman of the non-personal data committee, who has asked for commercialization of data as long as certain privacy and security frameworks are being followed. Under data ownership, like I mentioned, so a lot of the institutional arrangements around finance, around science and technology, they own data sets and they're kind of digitizing them and trying to integrate AI with the data sets that they own and operate. So there is a fragmentation of efforts that is visible at the domestic level. But we also have consolidated centralized efforts like the National Data Portal, which is being run by the National Informatics Center, and the National Data and Analytics Platform, which is run by Niti Aayog, which is the Planning Commission of India. It is interesting to note that the National Data Portal, which is run by the National Informatics Center, has just entered into a contract with Reliance where all of the cloud services will be managed by Reliance Jio. So not only are governments consolidating and exerting ownership over certain data sets that they had access to, they're also entering into collaborations with the private sector to solidify and strengthen their ownership over that particular data set. We also have efforts to Indian language data sets where the government is both trying to create its own version of generative AI and bring in a lot of data sets are being created for translation and for building LLMs in Indian languages. And the Indian government is using both all manner of strategy where they are creating forums that only Indian startups and Indian companies have access to. They're entering into agreements with certain foreign companies like Meta, allowing them using their models to kind of create data sets for Indian languages. And they're also incentivizing startups and Indian companies to take these initiatives forward. Next slide. So rethinking data sovereignty for AI, what are the lessons from India's strategy? Control and ownership of data is essential in some contexts, but it is not universally applicable. Data sovereignty can restrict access to higher quality data, and global collaboration is vital if we want to ensure quality of data. Overemphasis on data sovereignty can misrepresent the role of data control in regulatory success. Deployment and management of AI requires equal attention, as many of you have pointed out today. The shift from so I think for India and for other countries operating in this context, there needs to be a shift in focus from just territorial content to enhancing data quality and practices for better AI outcome. Next slide. Thank you.
You're at the guided discussion phase.
All right, did we want to have any questions or comment about the
The data governance papers, the 3 other questions. There's no live questions from the audience.
Hi, I have 2 questions, one for Brenden and one for Jyoti. But maybe the first question, not also to Dr. Desai. So we've observed that in terms of national policies and laws regarding the copyright of data, AI data set. So do you think like national laws and policies are still sufficient, or what's their roles in terms of, because most of the arrangements mentioned by Brenden were like contractual measures and also like collective measurements, so not measurement, collective means, and also like self-governing, like more like market self-governing model. But and in my observation, like in EU, US, the most laws and regulations related to AI data sets were mostly giving them kind of green light to let the companies to use. So what do you think still, like, what's the role of national policies and legislation can have on this and in this field?
I think both of us, go for it. I mean, my only observation would be that we see some advocacy to shape, I'll speak just about the United States, but in feel free to offer your observations. Leighton did a lot of research on national policies around what was going on around data enclosure. We just didn't have time to put that into this paper. So, but you know, in the US, I mentioned the Authors Guild looking for legislative activity around the CROs, particularly around antitrust, like getting those groups together and giving them antitrust protection so they can negotiate collective licenses. So that's one, you know, potentially a piece of legislation that might happen, but
I don't trust the copyright industry. I think the CRO is interesting, but I really think one of the things that motivated us is all this stuff came out of an academic mindset. OpenAI, who knows what was really going on? You know, he's a James Bond villain, fine. But to start, it was, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. We're trying to do something interesting. We claim to be more responsible than the big players, Google and Meta. I think in hindsight, they weren't. But those early papers were really in an academic mindset. They were, right? Because Google has a transformer paper and it was a ChatGPT 1 marker. They published a first paper about that big jump.
1 and 2 are both like written in the academic tradition. And
Absolutely.
3, they put out a report. with
Right.
A lot of missing detail.
And to me, to get to your point, I think that one of the things I'm concerned about is these market mechanisms may be okay, except for the real research we need, right? That's what, there's a big break here. So I would say that if there's legislation, it needs to carve clearly that difference between commercial actors and OpenAI play that game. We're a nonprofit. So there'll be some interesting things, but I think it's possible to sort that. But this move, markets work really nicely, except when they don't. And there's a huge base of what do we want in the future, which is why we're trying to say, look, there's another pivot where if Congress does this, I think they should also open up these other things, really balance out something. So it's not just, oh, we're the equivalent of ASCAP and we don't like it, or all these shadows on can you use it now or not. It's gonna have to be very broad, or although it's like your software in 5 years, oh, we didn't authorize that usage. We didn't authorize that usage. It's gonna be a mess.
so just a quick follow-up. That's the second part of the paper that I didn't get into is that I meant the mess, yeah. So I mentioned competitive advantage, you know, really what, you know, if we want to understand what is the impact of data exposure, we need to start looking at the competitive effects of these that's happening to these large platforms. And, you know, frankly, you know, Google is losing market share in digital advertising. They're under threat. Their main product of search is under threat. So there's an argument to be made that you have a competitive environment or being made more competitive by these attempts to enclose data and train better models, create better.
Or arguably because early on, it was unenclosed data that got these guys going.
Yeah.
Right, there's the paradox. That someone used up the phrase, pull up the ladder, and there's definitely people who pointed that out. That great, the first movers now have a huge advantage. And any new cool startup that might come out of a university or Silicon Valley or wherever.
OpenAI.
And exactly that, they're not gonna be able to play the same game, which when people were talking earlier. I got the job at Google partially because I said, you're really bad at talking to the public. And you could lead on privacy, because at that moment, that was their weak spot. I said, you've got the lead. You could actually be a privacy pioneer and no one could catch you. They didn't understand that, but you know, so those are the hard questions, but I think it's also, if I might pivot your question, Jyoti's point, we were just saying, and I had a little joke, I was like, so there's an interesting data enclosure if that's roughly what's happening in India, because India's scale, right? 1.4 billion people, that's a huge enclosure. So I'm curious for this question for Jyoti, what do you think about, wow, it's got strong legal power to box it, but it's also a huge sandbox to play in? Or does the government exert more control than I realize about what you can do with the data?
So I think with the Google Gemini example, that really, I can use that to illustrate this. So Google seems to be pandering to the Indian government's localization demands. But if you think about it from a big picture view, Google is essentially trying to extend its AI stack because it claims it's the only company that is offering the full stack in India. Everybody else has got other deals going on, and it's kind of the only company that can offer the full thing to the Indian government. And as more and more public services and private services come within the Google ecosystem, a data localization mandate for India doesn't seem that bad a trade-off. So it's simultaneously, while it might be pandering to a mandate to restrict data at the national law level, it is also gaining access and kind of a competitive advantage in a huge market.
Yeah.
And that's how a lot of these private companies are kind of negotiating and going about making these deals with the
Right.
government.
I mean, arguably, that's what the EU really did, right? It's a huge market. If you want to play in our market, here are our rules.
Yeah, I think I also add that point on from the China's case. So China is actually somehow a kind of result of what Indian government is trying to do, because if you look at China's data policies, there's a newly established data bureau. And the reason for establishing that bureau is actually because the Chinese government has accumulated a lot of public data through the digital infrastructures across the country. So there's incentive to utilize that part of public data to achieve multiple goals. And then now the Chinese data element policies, data element strategies is trying to utilize those data as part of the production elements of economic development. And so they're they're in the process of defining what is public data, and that part of legal defining is very interesting, and it directly connects with the public data concepts.
We lost our moderators, but would you mind, I think Laura has to catch an airplane if she went first.
I think I'm okay for another 15 minutes.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I think this might be a quick question. I'm very curious. It's difficult to know what percentage of the training data came from generative AI in the first place.
Oh.
Right, some small percent, but I suspect that percentage will increase exponentially over time. And I was just wondering, at first, there's a technical question and a legal question. Like if, let's say, Devin, you and I just wanted to hang it up in higher education and start a new company, would it be legal for us to train our model on content generated from one of these other LLMs? And what are the technical constraints to doing that? At some point, AI is going to be feeding itself, and 90% of the data will come from AI infused systems.
So the quick answer to your hypothetical on whether we could use something to then build something else, it'll probably be on the contract about right where these Gen AI systems started. But if it's relatively, you're just generating broad stuff, I don't think anyone could stop you, though, you know, the Copyright Office is absolutely having its head explode, has no idea what to do with, you know, if you give something 200 prompts, I would say that should get copyright. There was a lot of human interaction, but a lot of people think no. So this is a weirdly open and hard spot. Mark and I have talked about the AI will eat itself stuff.
Or
Right.
feed itself.
So there's the first issue is like. Most of our data is stuck in 2021 because there was little AI generated stuff because GPT wasn't really out there.
Right.
This is why I think these data contracts are really, really important. How do you get pure, unadulterated,
Fresh.
provenance known
Yeah.
data? Right, because scraping the internet is not safe anymore.
Right.
You will get AI generated stuff, and when you generate on AI generated stuff, your model deteriorates. The
Papers on that, Laura.
yeah, it's increasingly kind of right. So first of all, we're pissing in our own pool.
Yep.
Right. And this is also going to be a huge competitiveness thing. Who had the data in 2021, they're just gonna have an advantage. The other issue is, can I train on GPT? Can I just get an AI system to prompt GPT, get the data, and train on that? People have done that. It works really, really well. OpenAI doesn't like this, obviously. I don't know the legal aspects. This is complicated, but OpenAI has another mechanism. They can enforce it as soon as they figure out you're doing this. It's very obvious from a data signature. They just revoke your access. So
It's gonna be, it's gonna be more of an issue even with movies that are created by AI. I'm thinking about my cousin who's a Pixar artist and, you know,
Yep.
did Elemental and all those. As movies are used with generative AI and these get fed in, it's gonna be even more difficult to protect them.
Well, I know there's, you know what?
Let's-
I just a quick follow up on that, just to
Yeah.
clarify. So I thought very simplistic. Output of ChatGPT is now copyrightable. Why would be the legal restriction to use it to feed something else?
If it's not copyrighted?
No, I thought whatever comes out of ChatGPT, I cannot copyright.
Correct,
Right?
yeah. Well,
It's terms
roughly.
of service from the company.
Pardon?
Like
Well-
OpenAI has terms of service when you're using ChatGPT, so it's not copyrightable, but they have.
They're trying to restrict what you
They
can
have
do.
restrictions on what you can do, and if they can figure out that you're doing something that they don't like, they can restrict your access to the system.
I think that's in the New York Times case. I think that's what they're saying when the Times tried to get that information to come out, their articles verbatim.
Yep.
They said that the way they manipulated that was not how it's supposed to be used. And I think they're saying that's.
It was actually an attack from cybersecurity folks. Again, yes, you poke them enough, you could probably get full cough up, but the question is, in fact, what we're talking about all day long, I think one of the more interesting questions more and more will be, what sort of tolerances do we have? Is it 99% is society goes, it's good, for those of you who follow football? Or, you know, where is it? 1%? Okay, there's some nasty stuff that got coughed up, but from a software perspective, where's the guardrail and where's the harm? Is it everything is harmful, or is it, wow, a lot of people have their focus on a few nasty things, but the rest of the system is actually leading to really good stuff? I think that's a really hard question.
So I'm familiar with the articles about model breakdown, or as you put it more colorfully, pissing in your own pool.
Piss where you eat is the metaphor I was
Yeah.
going for. So.
Yes, so I'm curious how much you know about the proportions. You know, it's like, yeah, there's ChatGPT has been out there generating stuff for several years now, but there's also a vast amount of data on the internet and lots of new stuff being put on it. So what level do they have a tipping point where it really starts to deteriorate? Because I couldn't tell that from looking at the math in that paper, the model breakdown paper.
I don't know the numbers. I mean, my sense is, well, I think there's two aspects to this. One is you're looking at 15 trillion words at this point, so you have to get to a pretty significant portion of that. We have to remember though, GPT outputs look a lot like human. So it's really kind of more of a repetitive, there's certain things they like to talk about, and those become a larger proportion of the data. The other issue is this memorization aspect. So any one sentence anywhere doesn't have to be repeated a million times. Matter of fact, the rarer the sentence, the more likely it is. So if you get total gibberish coming out of an AI system that goes back into it, it's actually more likely to get memorized. So
Shannon, it's actually new. So it looks different.
Right.
Config.
Hmm?
Oh, just.
So it's just information theory.
Yeah.
That's what they're about. Right, so.
Yeah, it is information theory, so,
So it's actually not about proportion, but it's about uniqueness.
well, it has to be somewhat about proportion because
Well,
there's
it
a
is.
statistical
But
probability
that's
of,
too simple.
Yeah.
Right, so.
of getting the P. Right.
Can I just give you two fingers, a little nugget from a conversation with a data annotation company that I had last week. They were telling me that they have now gotten to a point where they used to have people manually annotating images or text or other things. They've now got, and they did that for a while, they've now gotten to a point where that's no longer, there's systems are, they've trained systems to do that, so they're really in more of a QA function where they're generating labels and annotations and other things that they need, and then using humans to sort of validate or do QA kind of assessments. But what they're having trouble with is that in a lot of cases, if they're using, it depends on what it is, but they're not necessarily using subject matter experts to do that QA. So ultimately, they're having to either train people to become subject matter experts or to become experts in something, or hire those folks, or send back lower quality results. But all of it's like this weird loop of they've generated a bunch of content that they originally trained or annotated, and now that's coming back and it's getting more and more precise, and they're trying to figure out what their business model is moving forward, because that's this path that they're on, they don't think is sustainable, essentially. Like this idea that you would have there was a whole data labeling, data annotation market.
Yeah.
That may no longer exist.
And just to add to this, that in India, one of the levers for regulation is also this, where the government is calling for more human intervention and moderation of how data is being trained and what kind of data sets and how companies are dealing with, improving data accuracy and context of data. So essentially using the whole human oversight to insert themselves into these business models.
Also add into like the question about proportions of how much bad information or data is coming in. So we talked about credible sources, and scientific journals are often, known as credible sources. However, there's a push right now because of open access and there's a public access mandate that more and more journals are moving away from subscription-based models and going towards like pay to play or pay to publish. And so there's an incentive from the publication side to accept more and more papers. And so what is happening is there's a flood from paper mills of all these AI generated papers coming in. And there's a limited resource and numbers of peer reviewers, so subject matter experts who can actually act as the first layer of guardrails for quality information going in. And so my question to you all is, how do you incentivize quality control at the human level when at the primary source of raw data coming in?
So I know that at least one large tech company is one of the ways that they're doing this. They're currently putting out job listings in parts of Southeast Asia and South America, asking for college age students or PhDs or postdocs to write papers for them to create custom data sets. Now, like, that's for many reasons, that's like a very just kind of eye-opening practice.
So
but
they create what?
They write papers.
they're basically creating a paper mill. But specifically.
To then feed back into like
human
that.
PhDs, postdocs, that level of author.
And the assumption is that comes out of that is not of the same quality.
The idea is that you're getting kind of in theory, a guaranteed human authored paper that
Nothing
is,
about the accuracy.
I assume that they're trying to specifically ask, like, someone to write on a subject that they are familiar with, but
that
you
doesn't
know,
mean they're
but
good at it.
they're not like reviewing it, no, it's not. It's.
It doesn't mean they're bad.
We sell our student essays.
Let's not. Well, in all seriousness, like student essays at universities are like another one, as I understand, one is sort of very lucrative data sets, and I would imagine that Georgia Tech and other schools are.
A decade of archives.
Well, I mean, there's a history of early ML to try and detect whether a student's paper was by them or not, and there's actually a copyright case about whether the company was allowed to use underlying essays, and they were, because the students arguably gave up the rights to the paper by turning it in. I think the service is called Turn It In, so yeah, there's a value there. This process that you're showing, Andrew, is just, I don't know, it's hard to wrap my head around paying for someone, like their incentives are to this question. I'm misaligned. I just want my paper to be in your data set. Give me $50. I'm gonna use ChatGPT. How are you gonna catch me? I mean.
Yeah, I don't know if they're doing any detection of like, is someone just doing this to generate, a paper using ChatGPT? They might be, but I think the incentive is to try to encourage like higher quality human data
And
sets.
just to mess with everyone, there's some good stories about why ChatGPT and other systems are actually good for academia, especially if you're a non-native speaker of the language in which you work. And one of the examples was actually an American in Japan who was fluent and wrote pretty well, but he used one of the early translate functions, and his colleague said, finally your voice in Japanese and writing is what you do when you speak. He just, something about how he wrote was too stilted, and it's two-way. So ironically, there are moments where this might be a good thing.
So that was a literal lost in translation, American in Japan.
Or found. Yeah, well, you're in finally.
No, well, that's all totally fine. One quick question, well, a question for you, Jyoti, about, you kind of like, you've laid out kind of like all those activities happening in India with regards to data and all those regulations. And it's a pretty comprehensive approach, right? To like the government tries to, and all ends to kind of like do that. How does it compare to other countries? What degree of like insights into that, the kind of look, there's a couple of different mechanisms and gave us some reasons why that is done. How orchestrated is that? And it sounds like in India it's pretty much orchestrated, right? It's the government mandate kind of like to protect data, keep it in India and so forth, data localization, you talked about that. How does it compare to efforts in other countries? Do you see similar efforts, or is this kind of like part of like, India's strategy to kind of like, shore up its digital technology base?
So I think India is it does both. It takes practices that are prevalent. So for example, you had an AI Act and something similar will prop up in India. So it's certainly creatively inspired by what's happening in the regulatory discussions in Europe or Australia or even the US. But I think at the surface level, it may appear that there isn't really a strategy. But I think the core strategy that India has had with regards to important technologies like digital technologies, not just digital technologies, is that they want to really believe in not being aligned to groupings, and they want to kind of retain that strategic autonomy to, play favorites or, side with whoever is the most, the best option in that moment. So I think that strategic autonomy, wanting to preserve that, is definitely a guiding factor, which is also what we see happening in Europe. The whole competition and trying to regulate from an antitrust perspective is also coming from that strategic autonomy that, European sovereignty is about Europe having control over its resources and having the ability to choose which companies it wants to partner with and not get locked into ecosystems. But I also think India is reactive, and especially reactive in a, if I may be forgiven for using the word, but in a very petulant way, where if it is not getting what it wants in the immediate term, it will slam dunk a regulation which will say, oh, there'll be traceability, or there'll be a fact checking unit, or all data sets will have to be that are, all models in India will have to be trained only on data and then these are generally left at the draft stage or pulled back. But the signaling at that moment is that, if you don't follow in line, like if you don't fall in line, we are going to come up with like really serious measures. And which lead to results like Google actually proactively, implementing localization. Because it's kind of wary and it's presuming that that's what the Indian government is gonna do. So it's very similar, in short, yeah. I think it's doing both, it's learning from other jurisdictions, but also trying to kind of retain enough autonomy for itself to do as it pleases.
All right, so we had something in the program here called a guided discussion. I don't know if you have enough energy left to do that. We've had quite a data dump today. I would just ask, do we have anything commonly agreed that we would tell regulators or legislators who are thinking they need to do something about AI, or people who want to propose some form of governance? Is there some specific points that we could make to them as they begin? Right.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
And my students that I have.
That's definitely no age cut.
So low hanging fruit, AGI is a myth.
Okay, everybody agree? Alan?
Saying, you know.
It's
not
a-
useful.
I feel like you guys aren't feeling it.
Feel the AI.
I think.
Right, who doesn't feel the AI? But Andrew believes that it's a useful myth.
Useful for some intros. I would say that it's not useful for trying to, as you correctly point out, redirect policy attention to the more pressing issues. And I suppose, like, to me, the framing that always uses the DeepMind when we talk about AGI policy is like, you can't, whatever your worries are about the future, about future technology, you can't address them to address the issues that we're facing here now. So if you don't develop meaningful norms and practices and standards, meaningful ways of being transparent about, what kind of systems you're building and how to test it for different kinds of issues that we're facing today, there's no hope for you addressing the future issues you're worried about.
Doesn't AGI get in the way of that? I mean, that's the thing, is no one can put their finger on it.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, I can't get around it, everyone's calling it just AI. I would prefer if everyone just said software.
Yeah.
I go back to your slide, it's software. You call it software, you acknowledge data, you acknowledge processing, you acknowledge hardware, and all of a sudden you've demystified it. That's a big step to then going to technologists and saying, here's an issue, here's a guardrail I want, here's something I'm worried about from a country perspective. And if you present a relatively clear spec, to your point, not always perfect, but something better than don't do bad things or try not to discriminate, a computer scientist will go, oh, maybe I can talk to you.
So I'm with you in this, but I think the challenge is that when we talk about general purpose technologies, maybe a better word to use
Sure.
than AGI. General purpose technology is how many of these companies are selling their products. They're saying Copilot doesn't have a single use. You can use it for anything. And I think that creates a regulatory challenge or a governance challenge that's a bit different from more narrow specific AI systems where you have a very clear use case, a very clear testing regime. The problem always that just kind of drove me nuts at Google was like, DeepMind, we talk about bias testing, an LLM, and I'm like, for what?
Right.
Like in what context?
That's
If you don't
right.
understand context, how could you possibly meaningfully assess this
That's
for bias?
You can't.
So the more you move into general purpose functionality, I think that raises. So, well, I'm with you that I think AGI is in a helpful framing. It's useful for marketing purposes and for kind of driving attention. I do slightly worry that we need to acknowledge that there is a distinction to be made between these kinds of narrow purpose technologies that we're trying to govern and something that is being at least marketed and sold as a general purpose technology. Now, whether you should be allowed to market or sell it such in that way is maybe one of the questions to ask.
But wouldn't you say computers? I mean, I've heard computers called a general purpose technology for many years. It's just like, okay, yeah, it is, but it's applications that you govern essentially, right?
Right, and that's where context is a big deal. To your point, and it came up earlier today, when I think you were talking about just when you think about, so again, disclosure, paper I wrote a few years ago. When due process and human rights are an issue, You don't get to use a system that you can't interrogate, in my opinion. And so if this system is slightly better because it did some cool LLM work, I don't care. You can just say, go do it slightly less well, because you can't install the guardrails, you can't interrogate it properly, you can't actually say that was wrong. And what's happening currently is Deloitte has some huge system, which I think that you were talking about earlier, Andrew, where it's healthcare benefits, right? In different states, and in Tennessee recently, they spent close to 40 or 50 million, and they're denying tons of legitimate claims to poor people who need access to healthcare. And of course, the contract's written as such, they're disclaiming their responsibility, the state's having to double invest on human beings to solve it. Like, to me, that's a moment of, ooh, we had a cool LLM AI technology. If you're using it as a public sector entity, you've got to be able to come at it just like any other software. Does it do what you said it would do? And when are you responsible when it screws up?
Yeah, so I think, I guess another way of putting this is, I think part of the challenge of governing general purpose technologies is clarifying and defining the actual tasks and uses that are appropriate for it. And that's not necessarily a regulatory solution, that's more of an internal governance solution. But the example that we're seeing right now is like Copilot in local authorities in or equivalent of like local government in the UK. It's being used it's being used for all kinds of horrible things. It's being used to make predictions about whether a child should be removed from a home. It's being used to make predictions about someone's criminality, used to make predictions about if someone's vulnerable, if someone's at risk of slipping into homelessness. Now that's it's not intended to be with this. And Microsoft explicitly says, do not use it for this purpose, because we don't want our brand associated with, some horrible, terrible outcome. But if you don't control or restrict a tool's use inside of your organization in that way, and kind of move it from this general purpose thing into something that is actually very specifically tasked to like just use it for summarizing documents or research, then you raise all these traditional governance challenges. So I think, to me, I'm not sure if that's policy solution so much as an internal governance.
Since Dean isn't here to make his case, I think Dean might be the only person who said this explicitly, but it might have been implied in other talks. He said, don't regulate applications, and his suggestion instead was to focus on enforcement.
He said conduct.
Enforcing
I
conduct.
didn't know what he meant by conduct.
I think what he meant is, well, I mean, my interpretation of that was, let the OpenAI or whatever sell their technology, do whatever. But when we see, like, can identify an issue with how that system is being deployed, like perhaps the case in Tennessee, right, or something like that, that you would bring down the sort of weight of an enforcement agency, and they pay a huge fine or they get sued or whatever, and then by extension of doing that a few different times in a few different cases, companies would be kind of scared into or made less, like lawyers will change their risk threshold within a company for them to behave badly or behave, I don't know, my graduate work was in part on this, and I think the challenge that I saw with that approach is that oftentimes you need, like I worked on credit scoring algorithms, and oftentimes you need, this is I think to Jyoti what your Indian government is doing, but you need some kind of a public data set in order to test whether a system is performing the way that you think it should be performing, whether that's a fairness assessment that you're trying to make on a population or something, or it's something else, or even if you're just trying to compare, you have to have something you're assessing against or towards. And we don't maintain a database of demographics like that in the United States in a way that we could use it for. And I just don't know if we want to go down that path, right? There's certain implications of starting to collect people's demographic information. I don't know what the database in India is collecting specifically, but to me, like there's a lot of.
But if I may just add to this point of enforcement, so I think here the closed versus open models is going to be, I think on the surface, it would appear that that's going to be a game changer. But at least with the Indian databases and that kind of experience, we've realized that a lot of these so-called digital public infrastructures claim they were open, but they remained opaque systems where you can't verify what kind of data they were trained on and how they're going about taking these decisions, even though there is widespread evidence of harms, including exclusion and, wrong assessments, etc. But and we've also seen that certain platforms that are private sector and so-called closed platforms are far more open about what kind of data they're using and how they're training. So I think thinking about how do we go about enforcing transparency, irrespective of what kind of model is there in front of us, that's gonna be a pretty important aspect, in my view. I don't know what others think.
I just think this point about don't regulate the application to me feels like a really nice out for providers of these systems, because you're basically offloading the responsibility for how a system you're selling is being used onto a downstream deployer who has absolutely no understanding of how it should be used and is being marketed and sold in the sense this is a general purpose technology. You know, the reason why in pharmaceuticals we have this whole idea of pre-market authorization and restrictions in how you market or advertise a drug is precisely for this reason. You don't allow it to be marketed in a way that is deceptive or misleading about its effective. I guess the scenario that kind of makes me think of is like it's like if Salesforce was marketing its CRM as a general purpose CRM, and you can do anything with it, and there's no restrictions, and you can access what data, who can access, share data across the system. It's just a bad CRM. It's just a bad product. But you're talking about users who really don't understand that, and I just, to me, it feels very weird to sort of suggest that we have to collectively play catch up with the bad faith claims the companies are making about the capabilities and security and safety of these systems.
You said that they're disclaiming, right? You said that they have a guardrail saying, don't use it for that kind of decision making.
Well, that's after the fact. That's after someone, they learn that's happening, not how they're marketing it. Okay, that's.
But they have guardrails on the bottom of ChatGPT. It says, don't use this information or check this information. That's it. All the chatbots have that.
Victor, what you got to say?
Well, first of all, I think what Dean meant was more like an ex ante ex post kind of differentiation. Suggesting that ex post enforcement is better than ex ante regulation. And that is slightly different than regulating an app or not regulating an app. I just want to throw a little bit of water onto the idea that transparency can solve a lot of issues. There has been significant research that's come out over the past couple of years that more transparency does not necessarily guarantee better results. And that more transparency does not help necessarily to solve some of the perverse incentives that may exist. And when we talk about transparency, we also what the transparency is for. If the transparency is for humans to make better decisions, for example, at pharmaceuticals information about adverse effects or nutrition information on groceries, then that the idea behind it is that we use the information to kind of shape our decision making. That's a very different kind of transparency than getting a peek inside the decision making of the machine. I think that we do not question a lot of decisions that humans make about various things. And we don't expect them to be transparent. And even if we ask them after the fact to be transparent, they're ex post rationalizing their decision rather than actually telling us what was going on. So therefore, suggesting that an AI system needs to be completely transparent in one form or shape or another about its internal decision-making strikes me as kind of moving the goalpost of what we are trying to compare. It's comparing apples and oranges. We are not as strict with the human decision makers compared to what we expect an AI to be. So I think that we need to be careful when we jump to on the transparency bandwagon. What is the transparency good for, and are we expecting too much when we are pushing for transparency?
Go ahead, Mark.
I actually am gonna agree with that about the transparency. I think it's quite limited in terms of what is actionable about the information you get there. And since I missed a lot of the morning, I don't know if this is relevant or come up, so just tell me to shut up, but you know, in terms of enforcement, there is. It is sort of a what's the word I'm looking for. There's sort of a privilege in terms of accessing the legal system on something. In terms of individual harms, right? And so the thing that I kind of worry about is like we talk about the system as a monolith or a company as a monolith, but in terms of the individual harms, like how do we know? How do we kind of ensure that, you know, only the people can afford to go after the big companies or to get recourse can actually do that? I think that's something I hadn't heard a lot about. And forgive me if that's come up today.
I'm not a lawyer, but some thoughts on enforcement after some conversations with my neighbor who is a lawyer. So my understanding is that, back to Dean's point, right, it's kind of like, do not preliminarily kind of regulate something that we fully understand. Wait until something bad happens, then the government comes in and then cleans it up basically with the power of the government, right? That kind of like assumes there is an agency that actually has authority to do that. And there are, you know, tools available to do a painful enough to make sure that company or organization doesn't do this anymore. From my understanding, particularly when you talk about multi-billion-dollar companies, it finds that, you know, even under, you know, big laws from the EU, right, those are small fines for those companies overall. Right? At least that's what I was told. So kind of this idea on a local level, on a local agency having authority to actually regulate or respond to a harm that occurred, having kind of like big enough guns to go after something like that. You know, even if you look at traditional sectors, I did that recently for what was it again? Called this thing again. Materials that are kind of poisoning stuff in building materials. There are some regulations in place, right? Kind of if you reach certain thresholds, and then you can go and basically in California, there's a state commission that deals with that. And I mean, the fines are pretty small, like $10,000, $50,000. It's nothing kind of like, it's not even a hand slap for a mid-sized company. So kind of like to what degree would that actually discourage a company to do the right thing? So this is about, I think we need to think a little bit more about enforcement, if that should be an actual tool to deal with AI. If something goes wrong, something like that, what Dean was talking about. The other question I had, something for Andrew, about, you know, you talked about Copilot that being used in agencies in the UK. I'm curious, I have an information systems background, and so back then, you know, in non-AI systems, someone would go to SAP or a big company who kind of sells a big software package, and then it would be an integrator who comes and kind of customizes the tool so it can be used in a particular setting, and then whoever, you know, bought the thing uses it, right? And then that's how it works. But with Copilot, does Microsoft just sell that to the agency and they do the customization themselves, or is it such a general purpose technology to just say, oh, you know, let's upload this case file and ask Copilot what to do about that? So kind of like trying to get a better sense of like, how's this technology actually customized for a particular purpose? I'm curious if you have any insights into how that works.
So I think that's the problem, is that it's not very customized for specific purposes, and it's being sold as an off-the-shelf general purpose system.
The general purpose being you just like put your data in and then you ask a question and then whatever comes out is.
Yeah, so the only case we've heard of where a local authority has been told explicitly by Microsoft, do not use it for this purpose, is when the local authority's IT team reached out and said, hey, here's a list of uses that our staff have told us they'd like to use it for. Is it appropriate? And the response was not about, you know, its performance of those tasks or its capabilities. It was very much a reputational management response of like, okay, do not use it to like make predictions about, you know, the likelihood a child might need to be taken out of a home, simply because we do not want a screenshot of like Microsoft Copilot recommending that someone have a child removed that ends up in Twitter and could harm us. So I think that's what's so strange to me. It's like, it's very clear companies actually do not want or think for reputational reasons and probably performance reasons as well, that it's suitable for certain tasks. Nonetheless, they are selling it in with either negligence or willful ignorance about it being used for that purpose. And it's only once notified that they're suddenly kind of calling out restrictions. So to me, that just feels insane. Like it just feels like a bizarre state of affairs we're in when we talk about these general purposes.
But we have both extremes. So if I may, we also have governments like India, which have in the past, in the context of content moderation on social media platforms or on internet platforms, actually demanded that you set up a local office and you have a representative who you can literally send to jail every time you think that, you know, the platform is and there was an interesting example where somebody used, I don't remember what, Google or ChatGPT to ask if Modi is a dictator. And obviously it was like, yes, like a really non-committal. Some of his policies could be read as being autocratic. And there was such a huge uproar over just something so basic, which wasn't even, outright calling him a dictator. So I think we have both. We have, and also on the whole idea of, DPIs and digital public infrastructure, which the Indian government has kind of failed spectacularly on trying to kind of protect rights and create avenues for people who are being, sidelined to actually appeal against the system. I think integrating AI would be a really smart strategy to outsource that liability to these downstream AI operators, because you couldn't guarantee and improve the system that you created as a sovereign effort yourself. And now you're going to integrate all of these global AI companies into your sovereign effort, and then you can hold them potentially liable for all the failings of the system that you probably failed to design properly from the day go.
To just to build on this, I'm sorry if you can go way too far. I think that what we're seeing is a dynamic where companies are being told to experiment to find your use case that works. And that's where like almost every company we talk to, including public sector institutions, are at. The problem is they're not being told how to do that experiment.
Yeah.
This is what I was saying in my social technical talk. We're at the stage where basically the liability for performance of these tools for really, again, high stakes tasks, or just even kind of everyday mundane business tasks, is being offloaded on the company's IT departments, public sector department IT departments, who have no idea how they should be assessing this. The UK government right now is trying to put out an updated version of its Magenta evaluation guidebook. It's basically like their own guidebook for how you do these kinds of evaluations of systems, and they're updating for AI. But even that, it really is like define metrics of success and, think about like your stakeholders. It's very high level. So I guess to me that feels like fundamental tension. You get to the space of wanting to experiment to give companies or businesses or institutions the ability to find that right use case. But at the same time, if you're not providing them with the training, the tools, and that, you're kind of leaving them in this just insane position where they're too afraid to experiment. They don't, because adoption never happens, or they take a really high risk and have
Somebody clamp down on
yeah, so basically quite terrible.
There's also just a very quick two finger. The problem also with the way that these things are done, the procurement is done into government agencies, is that often the IT department doesn't know what the rest of the agency does. I can tell you from experience that most of the people that we have in our IT departments are busy solving, I can't log onto my computer, I don't have a mouse, I lost a battery for whatever. Some of those types of IT questions, they're not fully aware of the work that the agency is doing on a policy level and everything else. So they don't know when they're procuring even though they would, that department is technically the department responsible for procurement, they don't know the full extent of what that department is actually working on and what those use cases can be. So they don't even have, they don't necessarily have the expertise in the procurement process to ask the right questions or to know what to experiment on or how to implement or what to evaluate. So there's a sort of a problem even in the design, in the procurement design, that affects the government agencies in particular, but perhaps IT departments and other companies as well.
One figure and your two figure, sometimes it's not a procurement thing, sometimes it's just rolled out as part of an enterprise platform. Hey, you have it today.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
But this gets to a little bit of what you were, I think one of your slides, Andrew, right? The very particular thing with substance, right? We all know that, right? Like I think Milton's quote was, if you work at Georgia Tech, the number of incredibly bad software decisions that are foisted upon people who actually use them is daily. So that's always a problem. General purpose aggravates it. But I want to come back to Victor's point. I disagree about some of the transparencies because I think we do demand it when due process rights. For instance, a lot of these decision systems for healthcare, whole compass thing, what was funny is listening to computer science go, that's 10 questions, not a very complicated set of parameters being used here. And I would still firmly argue, if a government agency wants to use software, human dignity, I would add to your agency, demands the ability to investigate, did it work as designed and what was the design? And we do that in the United States for things like breathalyzers. Right? So when you've got a specific decision-making system that a human's trying to use, I think when it comes to things like that, I have no trouble with the government saying, no. Not unless you can ex post interrogate the system to what was it built to do? What were the questions put in? And is it actually pretty accurate or not? Up to a type of scientific standard. Private sector, the whole public-private thing, very messy. But I think that would be a moment where if I'm in the government and I'm using Copilot because I think I should be able to assess child welfare, just no. And there have to be really big rules. You can't do that. I remember when I was in the federal government, right, every day. We own everything you do. We're watching what you're up to. It was a very good daily reminder. You could start putting that on government systems. By the way, you think you like Copilot. You really can't use it to do your job.
We can't use at least.
Devin, I think there is a misunderstanding.
Yeah, maybe.
And the misunderstanding is that I am not against the government testing its systems so that they perform and produce the results that they should produce. I just cautioned against a rule that requires transparency of the reasons the decision was made by a machine, that would actually solve the problem.
But I think sometimes
Let me just
sorry.
finish. I do believe that we need to focus on the outcome.
Yeah.
That is the decision. And the decision needs to be correct. How a system arrived at that decision is actually, to me, secondary.
Interesting, because I mean, again, could be just some of the people I've talked to is the hardest part here is in theory, if you come to a software designer beforehand and say, here's what the parameters of what discrimination looks like or what you're supposed to do. Theoretically, what's very cool about this is if you build from scratch with certain goals, we could build that and even have it so that we could hand off the system and a third party could test to see, did we build a specification without having to hand over the secret sauce, which is usually the trade secret pushback. But we can talk later. I think there's something about, do these systems need to be that sophisticated to accomplish these very simple bureaucratic goals? Where maybe transparency would be okay, because the claim is, oh, it's so much better than this system, but actually sometimes you can use, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, big old cool deep neural net, but you might be able to reverse that and go, I can break that into a decision tree, which is performing as well, and now a human can look at that. And that would be superior if you want ex post governance, I think.
But again, you can hardwire a decision tree, and the decision tree doesn't need to tell you why it arrives at a particular decision, as long as that decision is perfectly valid 99.9% of the time.
Okay.
All right, so I think we're gonna stop now. You are all invited to our reception, but you'll have to take a walk in this lovely cool weather to get there. And Bhagasha will be leaving you there. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll be cleaning up over here a bit. So you might want to take a break, gather your stuff. We're gonna start turning off the Zoom and good night, everybody on Zoom.